Thank you. The recording will be for people who are not able to attend, and they will be able to view this recording at a later stage. Now, what we're going to be covering today will be an introductions to the Standards Australia protocols, which includes the revision process, public comment, and adoption of the ISO standards. Some of you may have heard me talk about this before. There's a few little changes there. I'm going to talk about the various welding standards and changes that are happening. That's starting with welding safety. I'll then delve into steel structures, aluminium structures, pressure equipment, and design and fabrication. We will then move into testing standards, which is the NDT and destructive standards, welding consumables, age standards, and getting involved. And right near the end, I'm going to deviate from this subject briefly, and we will talk about weld fume. Now, before we start, I'd just like to let everybody know that it's important to understand that the information I'm presenting today is my personal opinion, and it may not be indicative of the views of either Standards Australia or Weld Australia. Now, should you require an official interpretation relating to any Australian or ISO standard, please contact Standards Australia directly. Now, the process to revise an Australian standard, or an Australian New Zealand standard for that matter, is outlined on the slide. Whilst anyone can prepare and submit a proposal, many committees do delegate this task to the chair of the committee. But as I have said in the past, please be aware that Standards Australia do not have the resources nor the time to revise standards in committee, as was done in the past. And as a consequence, well-advanced working drafts are favourably received during project proposals. To put this resource limitation into perspective, there are in excess of 250 welding and related standards published, with many now in excess of 10 years of age. The resources needed to revise all of these standards just does not exist. And it is important to note that irrespective of the origins of any draft submitted, it must have very strong support from all stakeholders, not just the proponents. Standards Australia can and do assist with the consultation process. We have stakeholder engagement managers that will do that for you. And the proposals that lack support will either be rejected or returned to the proposer to seek wider consultation and review. Now, once a proposal is accepted, a kick-off meeting must be held, which is usually within 6 months, and the committee typically has around 8 to 9 months to complete the initial drafting process in preparation for the submission of the draft to the Standards Australia editors for preparation for public comment. For this reason, well-prepared working drafts are favourably received during the project proposal stage. Back in the old days, the chair of the committee would generally ask members what changes they wanted to see in a standard and then proceed from there to draft the text in the meeting. Very slow and ineffective use of everybody's time. As previously said, Standards Australia do not have the resources nor the time to revise standards in this method. By way of comparison, revising a standard in committee, as was traditionally done, typically took at least 2 years or more just to prepare the initial draft. And worse still, one standard I'm aware of took over 10 years to revise. So it has been made abundantly clear that such long time frames are an aberration of the past and cannot be tolerated. If a revision is not completed in a timely manner, it runs the risk of being cancelled. Importantly, when preparing a draft, drafting personnel should be cognizant of the fact that users may read what is written differently from that intended by the committee. And therefore, concise, well-written draft definitions in simple English make standards much easier to follow. It also helps a couple of people if on the couple of people on the committee can actually think outside the box and try and think about how other people may interpret that, so then we can sort the wording out and get that right. Complex texts and notes buried under or within tables can be very difficult to follow and should be avoided at all costs. A standard that is difficult to follow only encourage the bush lawyers out there to look for loopholes and take clauses in isolation rather than in context, leading to complex and unnecessary disputations.
Sorry, Bruce, we've had a question
Sure.
from Malcolm Rigby. Who pays for the revisions?
Okay, in Australia, the revision process, the cost of the revision process is borne by Standards Australia and government contribution. It's different in New Zealand. In New Zealand, it's a user pay system. And so if standard is revised in New Zealand, the government of New Zealand, which runs Standard New Zealand, asks the nominating bodies to put their hands in their pockets and pay and contribute to the cost of the revision. As a consequence, we are now seeing less and less standards with the ASNZS moniker unless they're ASNZS ISO. That is a bit of a problem. I hope that answers the question for you. Now, Standards Australia policies for the revision and publication of standards can be found in their Standards Guide SG006. That's publicly available. But in general, the guiding principles are shown on this slide. Now, for the welding industry, where roles and responsibilities are traditionally well defined, the limitation on prescribing roles and responsibilities within standards is challenging, and roles can be assigned to some degree to the competent person. The challenge then is to define what constitutes the competent person. Now, from a welding perspective, ISO requirements in this regard are somewhat more user-friendly. And to this end, with the assistance of Standards Australia personnel, we were able to get ongoing approval for a range of roles and responsibilities across a number of committees. This was especially the case where we were able to demonstrate conformity with ISO provisions. Examples there include your welding supervisor, the welding engineer in limited cases, welding coordinator, welding inspector, and there's about 20 different titles. Other examples include where there is a statutory responsibility links within the work health and safety regulations that used in Australia. Now, conformity assessment, though, cannot generally be included unless the standard is specifically drafted as a conformity assessment document. For example, AS 3920, which is used in the pressure equipment industry. Now, compliance with these types of standards is usually informative rather than normative. It is important to note, though, that the scope of any standards revision or development must be clearly defined, as only changes within the agreed scope can be considered by the drafting committee. Note that the agreed scope is by default that presented to and approved by Standards Australia as part of their project proposal. Limited modification of the scope is permitted at the kick-off meeting, as can correction in any errors and anomalies, but any request beyond this must be submitted back to Standards Australia for approval. Now, this ensures that the project does not get into an unintended scope creep or growth phase, which can cause major publication delays. Now, adoption of ISO standards has been the policy of the Australian federal government for many years, irrespective of which side of politics was in power. The challenge with ISO adoptions is to ensure that they are technically relevant to Australia's needs and are practical in their application. Now, many ISO standards, unfortunately, have European origins and do not align well with Australian practices, which are more aligned with North American welding practices. They are therefore either rejected for adoption or need to be modified for local use. Some standards may need to be modified to meet local safety requirements, particularly on the electrical side, but are otherwise technically sound. In other cases, a standard may need to have an alternative or additional testing protocols added. For example, ISO has attempted to produce a structural design standard, but very few, if any, countries have seriously considered its adoption, primarily because local conditions may preclude the use of such a general standard, or the complexities within may make it technically difficult for users to apply. On the flip side of this, though, some excellent standards have been adopted, including the ISO 3834 series, which in Australia is the Asnzs ISO 3834 series. Now, this is a very logical and practical series of standards, and it applies primarily to ensure that weld processes are under appropriate control and the procedures being followed are reproducible at all times. Now,
Sorry, Bruce, we have two more questions.
certainly.
First one, are there any updates or reviews for 1554.3 coming up?
Not yet. It is. I will speak more to this in a subsequent slide. But the industry at this stage has not elected to do a revision, and it would have to join the queue because there will be other standards that have got a higher priority at the moment. But 1554 Part 3 will be considered, no doubt, in about 2 to 3 years' time, and we're waiting for an ISO standard to be completely revised, because we don't follow it, but we do tend to take cognizance of some very important sections in the draft.
Okay, and the next question, would you be able to give some guidance on who or where to get in touch if I have any queries on Vic Road Standards example section 630?
Oh dear. Well, obviously, if I would suggest, if you're working with the Vic Road systems, I would start with our Victorian engineers. Victor Blaine comes to mind there. But if you've got queries on the actual interpretation and understanding what's in the Vic Road specifications, you probably need to talk to Vic Roads as well. That'd be about all I could suggest at this stage. I'm not familiar with their requirements, so I really can't do a lot to help you in that respect. But I would certainly start with Victor, who's our Victorian engineer.
Thanks, Bruce.
Okay. Now, the ISO protocols and methodology are similar to those of Standards Australia, except that ISO can give a drafting committee up to 3 years to complete a project. It's usually a bit shorter with Standards Australia. This said, should the ISO drafting committee run out of time to complete a project, they can actually cancel the project. That is, the drafting committee can request the project be cancelled, and then raise a new work item to resume the drafting process. This effectively resets the ISO drafting clock and is important for complex projects such as the revision of ISO 9606 to combine all 5 parts. A key point that I must mention is that the Australian federal government's policy of adopting ISO standards where it is technically feasible, and it is imperative that Australian committees review and, where appropriate, comment on the relevant ISO standard drafts. Our mirror committees have access to all relevant drafts, and I cannot underscore the importance of reviewing all draft standards, including these ISO documents. Too many countries just vote positive without reviewing the draft content. If important to Australia, it is also imperative, where possible, to physically attend these ISO meetings so that Australia's views can be considered. Whilst in theory ISO have had teleconferencing facilities available for some years, in practice until COVID actually hit us all, it was difficult to, if not impossible, to access. ISO meetings, though, now tend to regularly occur via Zoom, but are typically limited to 3 to 4 hours duration and start at 1 p.m. Central European Time. Now, this usually corresponds with 9 p.m. Sydney time during our winter period on the East Coast, and 11 p.m. on the daylight saving time. And at 7 a.m. starts on the East Coast of the USA. And it's the West Coast of the USA that are up at around 3 or 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on the location. It is important to note that all ISO standards are reviewed every 5 years and are either reconfirmed, revised, or withdrawn. No exceptions on that point. Standards Australia have recently aligned with this 5-year cycle down from the previous 10 years, or for those old enough to remember, 15 years some time ago.
Bruce, we have another question.
Certainly.
Is there any official publication that provides interpretations of the Australian standards similar to Asnzs Section 9, where all Q&A are accessible?
There is a commentary to the Australian Standards 1554 series and some other standards. The commentary for the 1554 series is Weld Australia's Technical Note 11. Now, that particular document was originally jointly published by Standards Australia, the Australian Steel Institute, and Weld Australia. But for reasons unknown, Standards Australia decided back around the year 2000 they didn't want to continue that joint publication process. However, Weld Australia still publishes the commentary. And what we tend to do there is, as questions come in, or there's an anomaly spotted, when we revise the commentary, we include the questions and responses in the commentary so that people are aware of what's there. And we also use those questions and issues that arise from time to time in the revision process to clarify things. So if there's questions and issues that do arise, they are definitely listened to, and the responses will ultimately either end up with a revision of the standard in due course or a revision and publication in the commentary.
Okay, we've got one more question.
Mm.
If a business is certified to 3834, do they need to apply this standard to products that their customer does not require or want to pay for, i.e. PQRs, testing, WPSs, and 9606 welder certification?
I think that comes down to an ethical question, and the issue is going to be if you don't apply a qualified weld procedure, you may not have to follow the everything associated with the with what's in the standard. But if you don't follow the weld procedure, the issue is going to be is the work that you're doing actually going to meet the requirements of the standard that the customer is asking for, and do you need to consider doing some testing to verify what you're actually producing. So I would say it would be very wise to always follow some form of weld procedure that has been appropriately qualified, because if you don't, it's your reputation that's on the line.
Thanks, Bruce.
Right, now moving forward, we're going to talk about welding safety standards. Now, in 2022, Weld Australia identified some issues in relation to 1674 Part 1 fire precautions. And linked to this AS 2812, particularly around the definition of hot work and flame brazing. Now, the issues with both of these standards has now been resolved with the revised AS 2812 published in June last year and the revised AS 1674 Part 1 published in January this year. Now, with AS 1674 Part 1, the revision makes it clear that hot work includes brazing, particularly when performed as part of repairs of modifications to copper piping for air conditioning, and amongst other things as well, even just using a heating torch, for example, or an air gun in some situations. This clarification is necessary as insurers typically insist that this standard is followed by persons performing hot work. And this includes contractors and sole traders such as plumbers and air conditioning installers performing hot work. Excuse me. We are aware of a case where a house was burnt to the ground. So now it is a case of lawyers at 30 paces. As part of the revision, an option to simplify the risk assessment process for sole traders has been included. And in fact, we've included an example risk assessment in the back of the document. Now, as with the previous and the 2025 edition of AS 1674 Part 1, it is imperative that a risk assessment is performed and appropriate fire precautions are taken and a hot work permit issued when required. Now, in the eyes of the insurer, failure to comply can mean that the insured has not identified the hazards and the required controls associated with hot work, and insurance cover can then be denied, placing the business at risk of insolvency in the event of a fire. Now, while speaking of welding safety, Part 2 of 1674 has also been revised, and publication of this standard is due around June this year. The main changes include clarification of the high-risk Category C environment and requiring 0 volts at the torch during electrode changes in Category C. And now this was necessary following confirmed reports and multiple reports of welders receiving electric shocks when damp in a Category C conditions whilst changing electrodes. The other significant change for people to be aware of is in Category B welding, at the recommendation of the Queensland coroner following an electrocution of a welder. We've recommended that voltage reduction devices be used, so to limit the potential for severe electric shocks for welders in Category B environments. Now, this year there's been a lot of activity by various committees responsible for personal protective equipment. Now, Committee SF006 are currently moving to replace the AS 1338 series with modified adoptions of the ISO 16321 series. Now, these standards cover welders' eye filters or protective visors. Now, the draft AS 16321 is currently at the public comment stage, so it is some months of publication. Now, SF10, another one of these committees, has also adopted a range of ISO standards to replace our AS 1715 and AS 1716 series. I'm not familiar with the full details on this.
Sorry, Bruce, your microphone's gone a bit quiet.
Can you hear me now?
Try again.
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
Righto.
Yeah,
I'll
thanks.
just try and keep it closer to the
That's
mouth.
a lot better. That's a lot better.
Thank you. No worries.
Thank you.
Now, in talking about the changes to the 1715 and 1716 series, the existing Australian standards will remain in use and valid until the year 2030, which is 5 years away. And in the meantime, the adopted ISO standards will be gradually implemented as AS 1715 and 1716 are phased out. Now, the full details of these changes are going to be covered in a webinar produced by Standards Australia. And unfortunately, the webinar that was scheduled to run failed due to technical difficulties, and this webinar has now been deferred until Friday, the 2nd of May. So if you consult with Standards Australia on this, you'll be able to sign up for that if you're interested. Now, SF53, which is the last of these committees I'm just going to mention briefly, covers personal protective equipment not covered by other committees, including welders' protective clothing. Now, ASNZS ISO 11611, when it's published, will specify requirements for fire resistance, electrical resistivity, and UV protection for the wearer for both light duty and heavier duty welding and related applications. It's currently anticipated to be released around June this year.
Bruce, we've had another question.
Certainly.
Does ISO 2030 involve PPE related to laser welding?
That I'm not 100% sure of. There is on the laser side, I will advise that the International Institute of Welding is preparing a document to help with laser safety, particularly for handheld laser safety. It's in a reasonably advanced form now. I have seen drafts of it, and I believe it may be published around the middle of the year on the IIW website. The intention is to make it freely available, but some of the content I have seen is actually very consistent with Weld Australia's technical guidance note on laser safety. So if you review have a look at the technical guidance note, it's SW02, available on our website. You will be, it will have a lot of that content in it. But stay tuned, and Weld Australia will no doubtedly publish the relevant information in the journal and possibly connect in due course on that one. Now, the only other comment I want to make in relation to ISO 11611, it actually prescribes tests for clothing to ensure that the welder is protected for fire and heat and electrical resistance. And the recent revision of that particular standard also now covers UV protection as well. Moving to WD3, these are the standards that WD3 is basically responsible for, and there's about 23 of them. You will note that many of these will have an ISO basis, although it is not always immediately that the Australian standard has its origin in an ISO document. Where relevant, effective standards will usually indicate that they have taken cognizance of an ISO standard or standards in the preface. Now that the definition of welding inspectors has been resolved, the revision of the AS 1554 series is scheduled to commence once the revision of ASNZS 1665 gets to the public review stage. This said, I can advise that the revision process of ASNZS 1665 has kicked off, and the first meeting of the drafting subcommittee will be held once some technical issues are resolved. Under consideration is provision to address the inclusion of laser welding and additive manufacturing. With AS 2214, you will note that the standard has been retitled and split into two parts at this point in time, with other parts to follow. Now, this will provide for better integration with the with ASNZS 5131 and define the recommended technical knowledge and competencies required for relevant supervisors and inspectors. Part 1 of AS 2214 aligns with the 1796 certificates 10 and 11 from a structural perspective, and Part 2 is specific to bolting. And we are referring inquirers to the Australian Steel Institute, who have developed the training course for the bolting components. Now, the drafting of the theory component of this course has been completed and a practical jig is being manufactured. A number of specifiers, including Austroads, are moving to mandate qualifications to Part 2 for bolting applications as soon as people become qualified. Now, WD3 has also taken responsibilities for age standards produced by a number of inactive committees, particularly WD1 and WD6. Whilst their standards do not need active revision on an ongoing basis, their standards are critical to the industry. Standards for WD1, for example, cover terms and conditions including weld positions. WD6 standards covers the AS2205 destructive testing standard series. And these standards rarely change or need to change, so generally can be reconfirmed. There are, however, exceptions from time to time. In 2022, Weld Australia identified some issues with 1674 Part 1, as I indicated, and linked to this AS 2812, particularly around the definition of hot work and flame brazing. AS 2812 has been duly revised with 70 new definitions added, 8 terms modified to address errors or unintended confusion, and all terms have been renumbered. And it was published in June last year. Just recently, though, Standards Australia revised that due to a publication error, a number of diagrams were missing, and this is now being fixed. Regarding AS 1101 Part 3, for some time, Standards Australia have been aware of a number of minor errors within this standard, which covers graphical symbols for general engineering, with Part 3 covering welding and non-destructive examination. Unfortunately, due to resource limitations, these errors were unable to be immediately addressed. However, I can now report that a project kicked off in March this year to correct the reported errors and at the same time update non-destructive terminology from non-destructive examination to non-destructive testing. And this latter change is consistent with both common usage in Australia and ISO usage of these terms. Now, if users know of any issues requiring correction or modification in 1101 Part 3, please email me with the details as a matter of urgency, because it won't be, the drafting process is not going to take long, and then it'll be going to public comment.
Bruce, we have a couple of questions.
Certainly.
Will existing AS 2214 supervisors have to requalify or be able to apply for Part 2?
Part 2 is bolting, and it's totally different. So the existing 221 supervisors are covered by Part 1. So there's no change there for existing supervisors. But Part 2 only covers bolting, and that will require a separate course and training program.
Okay, and which standard will include additive manufacturing?
At this stage, we're planning to include it in 1665 Part 1. And I can also report that it will also be considered for inclusion in AS 3992 for pressure equipment. And in due course, we will look at including it within 1554 itself as well. But that's open for discussion at this point in time. Now, pressure equipment. Now, the standard AS 3788 covering in-service inspection on this list has been revised and was republished in June last year. This was a major revision with much of the core content of the body of the standard revised. Now, a question we do get asked from time to time is why mention of the ASIP inspection certification was removed. Now, as you know, ASIP is now being managed by Weld Australia. Now, the reason why the mention of the ASIP certification in this standard was removed is the same reason I outlined earlier, and that is that certification is deemed to be a conformity assessment requirement managed by third-party organisations and is not permitted in the standard. Now, both ISO and Standards Australia also have had long-standing policy of not naming third-party qualifications and requirements. And whilst we got away with it for a long time, the policy is now being very rigidly enforced. I am also aware of a number of users are asking some very specific questions as to changes of the content in AS3788. However, these should be directed to Standards Australia to ascertain that an error has not been made during the revision process. There are a couple of clarifications potentially required to 3788, and I suspect an amendment may be required either later this year or early next year. Now, ME001 are currently revising AS4343 hazard levels, and it is due to be released for public comment in the coming months. Now, a revision of AS3992 has also kicked off, primarily to update welding consumables associated with brazing, and the opportunity will also be taken to clarify some remaining issues and provide options for additive manufacturing of pressure components. Weld Australia has also been asked to consider leading a revision of AS4458, and I can confirm that a working group has held a number of meetings and the drafting process is well advanced. Once completed, the draft will be submitted to Standards Australia to be utilised as the basis for the formal revision process. Lastly, the standard I do want to mention is it is anticipated that the revision of AS4041 on pressure piping will get underway in coming months. The current is to commence this process once the drafts of AS3992 and 4343 both get to the public review stage.
What a question, Bruce. Will an AS2214 supervisor and IWI inspector automatically receive structural welding inspector certification similar to Cert 11?
That I don't know. That's up to the standards bodies. It is if you've got the meet the prerequisites, then it's a matter of applying to whoever certified or issued your certificate, and they will advise people in due course. But the intention is if you've got a welding supervisor certificate and a welding inspection certificate. I'm not talking about the basic level. I'm talking about higher levels than basic. Then I would expect that your application will be looked at favourably. The basic welding inspector doesn't cover all the syllabus items. That's the issue. But the inspector level qualification is designed at the equivalent level to the International Welding Inspector Standard. Now, looking at AS 4100, the design standard 4100 underwent a revision in 2020 to remove fabrication components from the standard and refer to AS 5131 for all fabrication requirements. Now, for information, the 5131 is similar in content to the European EN 1090 Part 2, but it is not identical. 5131 incorporates reference to Australian, New Zealand practices and standards throughout, and an ISO equivalent to this has now been published as ISO 17607 in 6 parts, with Australian experts engaged in its drafting. And importantly, ISO took cognizance of the contents of both EN 1090 Part 2 and AS 5131. And before anybody asks the question, I don't know what the Australian intention is at this stage, whether it will be adopted. or adopted as a modified revision, or how that will proceed. That discussion is yet to happen. Now, the major revision of 4100 is well underway, with initial drafting now due for completion in coming months. It was hoped to have it finished by now, but it's running late. There will be a lot of changes within the standard being updated to align with current best practice, and associated with this revision, once completed, will be the need to revise 5131, and this has been flagged. Now, as I said, I don't know whether we'll be looking at the adoption of the ISO standard, or whether or not we will modify 5131 to take cognizance of the ISO standard. That discussion has not been considered.
I've got a question, Bruce. Sorry.
Mhm.
We've got two now. Which certificate is best to pursue to grow a career as a welding inspector, as a metallurgist, if I said that right?
Yes, you have got it right.
Okay.
Well, I'd just work your way through the various standards. Maybe starting off with supervisors, because the supervisor then leads into the inspector. Whether you go for the structural or the pressure side is up to you and the industry you are involved in. A lot of people do cover both, and go from there. But down the track, if you are a qualified metallurgist, I would be looking beyond the supervisor inspector level, although you can start at that level almost certainly, and that's a very good starting point. I would then be looking more towards the IWIS, the International Welding Specialist, and even going to the welding engineer down the track as well, the IWE, for example.
Okay, we've got two more. In AS 4100, are operators of auto process classed as welders?
4100, wrong standard. It would need to be addressed through 1554 and 3992, and in the revision we're going to clarify that that comment. Now, for people who operate welding equipment, if they can actually change any of the welding parameters, they would be regarded as welders in charge of that equipment and need some type of qualification process. If all they're doing is loading items into a jig and pushing the go button and have no other controls, then there is a very strong view that those people that need to be competent at what they're doing, but they don't necessarily need to be regarded or qualified as a welder. The welder qualification will only come in if they have any form of input or control over any welding parameter, including the position of the welding head, for example.
Okay, this one's a bit longer, so bear with me. Is there a consensus with the audience regarding hardness failures with overseas materials, particularly GR 350 grade, that is typically higher CEQ value, primarily China and Korea exports? From my experiences, I have been challenged numerous times on this issue, even with significantly increased preheat levels. It is time we have government bodies imposing Australian steel content to some degree as mandatory for projects in Australia.
Okay, can I hold that one over to the when we get to the end of the proceedings, and I'll address that at that point.
Yep, okay. And then is 5131 being replaced by ISO standard?
Don't know at this stage, as I've already mentioned that one.
Thank you.
Right. Now, looking just going into the MT007 again, these are the list of standards that that committee is either responsible for or has an interest in. Now, there have been some ISO standards to replace some of these NDT standards, and whilst the ISO standards have not necessarily been adopted, they may be considered in the future. Now, AS3978, for example, was withdrawn, but has since been restored as being an active standard, but it's actually now well under revision, and the public review draft is probably not that long off coming out for review. Also, MT007 7 initially agreed to adopt quite a few of the ISO standards, but ran into a few roadblocks to replace the aged Australian standards, particularly in the magnetic particle component where there was a safety issue involved. Since then, the committee has cooled on the idea of the ISO adoptions to replace age Australian standards, and revision of these age standards is yet to be considered. Now 17637 for visual examination is currently managed by WD3 due to links to the ISO 9606 standard series, and this clashes with 3978. But that's now being rectified. And as I said, that standard will shortly go to public comment. Now, from the radiography and ultrasonics perspective, these standards were not being considered for revision or inclusion under the ISO adoption process, primarily because the 1554 series would need to be revised to accommodate those standards, because that takes a very different approach. Now, MT007 is in discussion with WD3 to consider the adoption of, in some suitable form of standards covering phased array, ultrasonics, time of flight, and digital radiography in due course. So some of that may happen whilst the revision of 1665 is underway, because some of those standards will be relevant to that for the welding of aluminium. Now, the Asnzs test standards series are listed on your screen, and some of them are actually now direct text adoptions or clones of the relevant ISO standards. These are the Asnzs versions. Now, other standards shown in italics are aged and over 20 years old, but they are still quite valid. And it's rarely necessary to revise these standards, as I have mentioned. Now, the Weld tensile testing standard and Sharpie testing standards have both been revised by ISO, but there are currently no short-term plans to adopt either of these, even though AS 1391, for example, is an ISO clone, and that is of the tensile testing standard. Now, to adopt the ISO Weld testing standard, which is ISO 4136, a modified adoption of the ISO standard is likely to be required. It is worth noting, though, that the shear test standard in AS 2205 Part 8, Part 2 is now under revision to cater for shear testing of bars and welded fabric, and cognizance has been taken of an ISO document for that particular standard. Now, public comment on that closes very shortly, I think about the 24th or 23rd of April. Now, most of these consumable standards are either direct text adoption of the ISO standards or are modified adoptions, and standards in red are actually in the process of being updated to the current 2025 ISO editions. Now, some manual metal arc and submerged arc consumable standards are currently being revised by ISO, and updating these to the latest editions of the ISO will be considered once ISO have completed their revision process. Regarding the manual metal arc standards, should fabricators need to import the ISO equivalents from Europe or elsewhere, this is permissible and it does not affect any pre-qualification status. And it should be remembered that the Australian standard numbers have been used to identify the Asnzs version of the direct text adoptions, primarily due to the fact that the intended Asnzs ISO numbers were already in use by other Australian standards. Now, Asnzs 2576, which covers hard facing, is being revised at the moment, and public comment that was held last year has been resolved. Now, it hasn't been published primarily because the committee is currently sourcing updated photomicrographs of the various microstructures, and the standard will be published once this process is completed. Now, the focus of the 2576 revision has been to align with some ISO provisions where appropriate And when published, ISO is actually has expressed an interest in using this Australian standard as the basis for an ISO standard. So we're going back the other way.
I've got a question or comment. Could Standards Australia stop publishing AS standards that are direct clones of ISO standards, as the ISO standards get updated, but many months later, the old AS clone still exists?
That could be an option, but the reason why we republish the AS the ISO standards as AS/NZS ISO or AS ISO is Australian committees usually look at the ISO standard to see whether it can be it's suitable for publication in Australia as it is, or whether it needs to be modified. And there are a lot of safety requirements that tend to creep into some of these standards that prevent that happening, and they have to be modified adoptions for that very reason, particularly on the electrical side. And to some degree, I'm suspecting this will also happen down the track on the laser side in due course as well. But definitely electrical side, and there are other safety requirements as well that need to be considered under those circumstances.
One more question. Will WPS docs now have references consumable ISO standards? This could cause some confusion to those in the industry not on this webinar.
Can you just repeat that if you don't mind?
Will WPS docs now have references consumable ISO standards? This could cause some confusion to those in the industry not on the webinar.
Okay. There was dual certification of the old Australian welding consumables, and these are still listed in some of the current Australian standards, but I think we'll find that will gradually be dropped moving forward, because there should be no stocks of old Australian standards consumables left in the country. They'll all be primarily ISO standard consumables or AS/NZS ISO standard consumables. Now, mention of the ISO consumables is fine, as long as the fundamental requirements, say on the structural side, where you have to have a minimum impact resistance requirement of 47 joules as opposed to 27 base that the Americans tend to use. That's acceptable for pressure equipment, but not on the structural side, where we want the higher impact resistance for brittle fracture prevention. I hope I've answered that one. Okay, now just moving forward, 5100 Part 6 from the Bridge Code has been amended, and I'll say just a tad more on this in the moment. 1554 Part 2 was revised a couple of years ago, but since publication, an error was found in the threaded loading table. This error, the table itself is correct for the stud types listed. However, it was only reported after publication that the stud grades are not those typically used for threaded studs. So that has got to be fixed in due course. But that has been delayed due to a need to improve the method used to validate the performance of these threaded studs. Now, ISO 13918 on steel studs was adopted by Australia in 2020, and these actually provide access to a variety of stainless steel studs. And I'm going to touch briefly on 4671. Now, this particular standard includes reference to two new very high strength reinforcing steel grades, these being 600N and 750N. And at this stage, the reinforcing industry has not progressed a need to revise 1554 Part 3 to consider the welding of these new materials. When that particular industry decides that, yes, they want to move forward on that, they'll need to start talking about submitting a project request in due course. Now, the Bridge Design Standard 5100 Part 6 has been amended to remove anomalies between it and 4100 and 5131, and also the New Zealand Standard 3404 Part 1. Of particular note, the provisions for the management of lamellar tearing were seen to be too conservative in some circumstances, and the provisions have been modified to address this in 5100. And these modified provisions are finding their way into other standards, including 4100, and will ultimately find their way into the 1554 series too. Now, work to revise and produce a commentary on 5100 Part 6 is now underway. Now, in talking about age standards, until recently, age standards were defined by Standards Australia as standards published at least 10 years ago. Age standards can be problematic if the original drafting committee is inactive. And in some cases where the work is transferred to another committee, the standard can be reconfirmed or revised, but if it's missed, it can be withdrawn. For example, hoses for welding gases, which is AS 1335, was withdrawn some years ago, and the drafting committee no longer existed. However, it was still required, and with the assistance of Standards Australia, ISO 3821 was adopted by as ASNZS 1335 by Committee ME2. Now, also two other standards that are being knocked out, and I'm not sure how we're going to address those at this stage, is 1988 Part 1, which is welding of ferrous castings. I'm hoping in due course we can include some of that in the 1554 series. And AS 2074 cast steel has also been withdrawn, and that's proving somewhat problematic for the foundry industry. These withdrawn standards can be used, but they haven't been updated. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the Standards Australia are now following a similar process to ISO, where published standards undergo a systematic review every 5 years to maintain currency. And in the case of ISO, their standard will be reconfirmed or recommended for revision or withdrawn. And in the Australian context, unless resources improve to enable revision, it is likely we'll see recommendations for ISO adoptions or modified adoptions on a more frequent basis. It is therefore imperative that Australia is represented and active on the relevant ISO committees, and travel subsidies are available in many cases for delegates to access, and increasingly many ISO committees are meeting either electronically or hold hybrid meetings, albeit at awkward times for Australia. Now, moving to ISO, and ISO SC 10 and 11 are active subcommittees, and Australia is well represented on both of these. I have attended numerous meetings. Now, numerous comments have been made and by Australian representatives based on our local experience with these standards, and our views have been well received and are well considered. And as noted earlier, ISO 17607 has been published in 6 parts, and Australia was active on the committee responsible, which is TC 167, and that's mirrored by BD1. Importantly, ISO took cognizance of the contents of this Australian standard during the development of the early drafts, and they've also instigated a new project for a structural welding bolting coordinator based on the principles of ISO 3834. Now, the proponents of the bolting supervisor of Part 2 of AS 2214 were well aware of this proposal and have taken cognizance of early drafts to ensure alignment. It is important to note that not only are our trading partners active on these ISO committees, so are our competitors. So Australian participation is imperative, or we could find ourselves standardised out of our market. Of interest to our New Zealand cousins is the project on welded joint performance of seismic steel structures. I've listed at the bottom of the slide. Now, just very briefly, Weld Australia has published Australia's first standards map, which you can see on the screen, and it is available for free download from the Weld Australia website as Technical Guidance Note TGN SG07. By referencing this map, users will be able to locate the subject area, then identify key standards used in that application at a glance. Version 2 of this technical guidance note was published in 2024. Now, from the ISO side of things, the Swedish Welding Commission has also mapped the ISO standards used throughout the European community. It was drafted by Matthias Lunden and is periodically updated, and the current version was May 2024, and you can download it from the Swedish Welding Commission's website as shown on the screen.
Bruce, we have a question.
Mm-hmm.
Where can I find updated requirements to complete the required information in records for WPQR and WPSR?
I'll hold that over till I finish, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Righto, just before we finish talking about standards, I do want to deviate slightly and talk about interpretations. And I'd like to give a very quick overview of the standards interpretation process and how it needs to work. Now, before you do submit any form of request for an interpretation, please do not read the standard clauses in isolation. Read the standards in full, because if you don't, you will simply waste everybody's time. Quite often, the request for interpretation can be answered further down the line by reading the rest of the standard. Now, if an interpretation is required, you need to clearly state the question in writing, but there are 3 requirements that you must adhere to. Firstly, clearly identify the standard and its addition and if any amendments are applicable. Sometimes standards are amended, but are not necessarily, they may not be applicable to the amendment. State your question clearly and concisely, giving a brief description of the situation, identifying the relevant clauses in particular, and then prepare your proposed response, what you think the answer should be, in a way that the committee will give either a yes or no answer. Now, if the standard is silent, the committee will respond accordingly. An interpretation can only clarify the intent of the standard, but it cannot change what is written. Now, any request for ISO interpretations must be managed by the National Mirror Committee, that is the relevant Australian committee. Now, if the Australian committee cannot resolve the question, then they will submit the question to ISO for a formal response. ISO will either ignore or refer questions posed directly by users back to the National Mirror Committee. Please do not flood the committee with any requests or ask it to resolve commercial disputes. They will not get involved. Most issues, though, can be resolved if people read the standard in full. Now, I'm going to deviate slightly for a few minutes before we summarize the proceedings from today and answer the remaining questions. By popular request, I would like to give a very brief overview of the situation regarding requirements for the control of weld fume. As many of you would realise, the situation is somewhat fluid and has been for some time. There is currently no standard that specifies requirements for weld fume. And this said, 2 attempts to produce such a standard for the control of weld fume were made in the 1990s, these being DR 94184, which was scheduled to be AS 1674 Part 3, was released in May 1994, and a further draft based on public comment was produced as an interim standard back in April 1995. However, due to vested interests at the time, the standard did not proceed and the project was cancelled. The then Welding Technology Institute of Australia and the CRC for Welding and Joining undertook research which culminated with the publication of our weld fume or the fume minimisation guidelines in 1997 to produce guidance on fume control requirements in still air or worst case welding conditions. Weld Australia has revised these guidelines on multiple occasions, taking cognizance of both IARC's ruling on weld fume and cancer in 2017, and more recently, Safe Work Australia's revision of their workplace exposure standards for airborne contaminants released on the 18th of January 2024 that reduced the exposure standard for total fume from 5 milligram per cubic metre to 1 milligram per cubic metre on a time-weighted average over an 8-hour period. Now, in April of last year, Safe Work Australia announced that from the 1st of December 2026, these exposure standards, or WESs in short, would be replaced by exposure limits, or WELS, W-E-L-S. Specifically, there will be a reduction in manganese exposure and limits on both the inhalable fraction, which will be 0.1 time weighted average, and respirable fractions, or 0.02 time weighted average. Now, the difference there is the inhalable fraction is the fumes that can be stopped by the nose and the mucous membranes, and that you can cough and sneeze or blow your nose and remove from the body. The respirable fractions, though, will go straight through the body defenses and deep into the lungs, and then can pass into the bloodstream. So that puts a bit of that helps you understand the differences between what we're actually looking for, or the hygienists are looking for there, and the regulators are trying to regulate. Now, in addition to that, it is, as we've been advised, that the requirement to prevent chrome 6 from forming has been set out. How this is going to occur, we have got no idea at this stage, and how it's going to be enforced. Chrome 6, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a known carcinogen and is quite mutagenic. It can be produced when welding stainless steels and also when hard facing. And Chrome 6 was the subject matter in a movie some years ago, and it was quite a nasty poison, and you can read up all about it, or watch the movie Erin Brockovich, which covers that. And it's also planned to reduce cobalt from 0.05 to 0.02. But there's more, unfortunately. Both aluminium and copper weld fume is currently under review by Safe Work Australia. Now, despite all this doom and gloom, I will answer a question in a minute on this one.
Okay.
Despite all the doom and gloom, there are some options available to users of the welding processes. In some European countries, there is a requirement to produce fume data sheets based on 90% of the maximum recommended welding current. There are no currently universal requirements as far as we're aware, but definitely in Germany and other countries with a fume limit similar to Australia. The driver appears to be the European roadmap to carcinogens. Now, these data sheets are particularly helpful when conducting a risk assessment, and it is recommended that Australian users ask their suppliers for copies of these data sheets if your consumables are actually sourced from Europe. And if they are sourced from Europe, the sheets will most likely be available. Now, separate to this, real-time fume monitors are now available, and I have spoken about these in past webinars. They are particularly useful for estimating the fume exposure for people working near welding operations, but they are not a substitute for formal air monitoring by a hygienist. In all cases, start by conducting a risk assessment. Now, the hazards to health and safety must be identified and controlled, and the regulations, though, do not tell you how this must be done. As you can expect, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to weld fume control, and each work site and control option should be individually assessed. Now, Weld Australia can definitely help with this process. Weld Australia offers fabricators a number of options to help them identify appropriate controls to minimise their emissions of weld fume. Our fume minimisation guidelines are an excellent place to start. Now, the QR code on this slide, which I've put up there, will take you directly to the document on the Weld Australia website, and it can be downloaded free of charge. So if you put your phones to that particular QR code, it will take you straight to it. Now, this document also contains a lot of useful material and advice, which I have very briefly summarized on this slide. Now, as I've said, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to fume control. Every fabrication shop is unique to the type of work and layout that they perform. Now, regulators do promote fume capture via a variety of methods, but not all methods are equal in all cases. On-gun extraction should be considered given the improved technologies currently available, but may not be suitable or effective when welding out of position or where access is limited. Alternative control needs to be considered, which is where the risk assessment is really important. Where there is little evidence of serious consideration being given to the use of fume capture, it is going to raise doubt in the mind of the regulator, and if the inspector comes knocking, they are likely to ask you for a formal air monitoring program to be performed to demonstrate your controls are adequate and both the welder and all people nearby are well protected from excess weld fume. Now, powered air purifying respirators, we know, are highly effective to protect welders and especially from excess ozone exposure. Now, fume capture devices are generally ineffective against ozone because ozone forms wherever there's UV. PAPRs, though, doesn't matter where the ozone is, the PAPRs draw air from behind the welder, and as a consequence, there's not much UV in that area, and so there's usually very little ozone present in that area, but you can also add a filter if need be to filter it out. Now, Weld Australia also operates a free fume hotline to assist fabricators in assessing their control requirements. The number is 1800 212 988. And just recently, Weld Australia engineers are now offering a new service to members and are able to perform a fume safety audit for fabricators for a small fee, which includes a written report on recommended controls. Please ring our general number 1800 189 or 900 to access this service, or if you know the engineers directly, you can contact them directly and discuss the situation. Failing that, drop me an email and I'll pass the request on. Now, we're just going to summarize the standards component of this presentation, and then we'll be open for questions from everybody. Now, standards are evolving, which is important for users to stay abreast of these changes. And there are at least 3 ways of doing this. Intertek, which was formerly SAI Global, has a standard watch program that users can sign up to and get notification when changes occur, including release of revisions for comment. Standards Australia also published a review list of standards for public comment, and you can subscribe to Standards News updates. And of course, being Weld Australia members, Weld Australia publishes a quarterly update in the journal, which covers a lot of this information for you. Everybody can be involved in the standards drafting process by commenting on the free publicly available drafts during the 2-month public comment period. And these can be accessed directly by the Standards Australia website at www.standards.org.au. Be aware that you will need to create an account and log in to access the draft for comment. This said, when a standard is being revised, download and comment on the draft, because if you don't, it will be assumed that the proposed changes are acceptable. If you do comment, clearly state, please, what should be changed, why, and provide draft text for consideration. Members of the primary standards committees are appointed by nominating organisations and are experts who typically set strategy and manage the revision process. It is the committees that have input to your ISO drafts. Drafting, though, is often done by industry experts and or representatives on designated subcommittees or working groups. Lastly, if you hear people denigrate the move to ISO standards, just remind them that with over 250 welding related standards to maintain, the resources to manage these standards just don't exist, as the companies who formerly sponsored their technical experts' involvement in standards writing no longer do so, given that manufacturing operations have been sent offshore. Now, I don't know how many of these manufacturing operations will come back under the current economic circumstances, given what is happening in the USA and elsewhere, but we can only hope that we can rebuild Australia's manufacturing resources sooner rather than later. And on that note, I'm going to ask if there's any questions. The two QR codes here on this page will take you directly to Weld Australia's website. So if there are any questions, I'm now open to answer them for you.
We had a question from Malcolm Rigby. There is a lot of data on acceptable weld fume exposure. Is there any data on the released volume of harmful weld fumes based on all the materials of construction used during welding work? This should be something seen on WPS. The confusion is around exposure time and fume volume present.
Oh, that's an excellent question. My colleague, Cornelis van Nieck, who's online, is in the process of putting together a project as we speak to look at the evolution of weld fume with time to ascertain what is the time required before you actually have to implement protection from a welder's perspective. But I also mentioned those fume data sheets just earlier, and that those data sheets at a given amperage also mention or will give you the rate at which fume is evolved at a given amperage. These, if you can access these documents, they can be useful because it enables somebody with some mathematical smarts to work out what the exposure will be based on the number of welders and the air exchange within the building and your fume capture. So there are possibilities moving forward. Weld Australia is certainly well aware of them, and we would certainly encourage people to produce these fume data sheets that the fabricators can then access and refer to in due course.
Okay, and how do we get informed about opportunities to join drafting committees?
It's basically it's a matter of letting Standards Australia know. We are often on the lookout for people to join specific committees. The vacancies don't occur from time to do occur from time to time, but on the main committees, but not regularly. But it's the subcommittees where we do need to often draw volunteers in, and we've actually just recently formed quite a wide-ranging drafting committee for 1665. It's drawn people from a wide range of interests into that committee. That process is actually managed by Standards Australia. It's not managed by Weld Australia. And that's by necessity. The Weld Australia has some interest in some of these committees, but by and large, it's Standards Australia that actually manages that process, because it's very important that no one interest dominates on any committee or any drafting committee. That's how, because that's how standards can be somewhat biased, and then. And if you're not careful, that's where people can be standardised out of the market. So it is important that the committee remain balanced across a wide range of interests. That's why you see a lot of nominating organisations on a standards committee.
Okay, and then we had that question earlier, if there was a consensus with the audience regarding hardness failures with overseas materials. particularly GR350 grade?
Grade 50. I think I know who's asked this question, and the reality is the welding standards used in Australia, the preheat levels do not guarantee any hardness level below a certain limit. Now, if a customer requires a hardness level below a certain limit for any particular reason, you may need to develop weld procedures to meet that, which will require could require additional preheat or heat input at the given time. So if anybody else has got any comments, certainly put them in the chat, and so that everybody can see them.
Any other questions from anyone?
There was one other question I think you started to ask, and I jumped in on it earlier when I started the fume section.
I thought we already did that one.
Good. Okay.
Yeah, I
No
think
worries.
so. If I'm wrong, please correct me, whoever asked the question.
Unless there's is there
Arthur
another question
Rifkin.
coming through?
Yeah, Arthur Rifkin here. I did ask a question regarding the two welding procedures required, the specifications and qualifications. I need to update what I'm using in regards to these two reports. And is there any way I can access the latest regarding ISO as well?
Okay, I assume you've got an old weld procedure you're wanting to update. Is that correct, Arthur?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, if you have a look at in the 1554, I think it's Appendix G, but don't quote me on that. It gives you a bit of guidance as to the process to follow to update the relevant consumables. A lot of the old Australian welding consumables are still available, and the way that you know what the new designation is compared to the old designation is by the trade name. So if the trade name has actually been recorded on the weld procedure, as well as the welding classification, you're in luck, and you can then just put a note on the procedure itself, the WPS, for example, put a note that you use this particular consumable. It's identical to this particular consumable from when the procedure was originally qualified. If that's not available, you've then got to start looking in detail at the classification of the consumable itself. The strength requirements are very straightforward. The impact requirements too are reasonably straightforward. And then if you know enough, by looking at the old Australian standard versus the ISO standards, you can then work out the positionality of the consumable and also the shielding gases and the like. So there are ways to manage that process. But the general instructions can be found in an informative appendix in the 1554 series. Certainly part 1's got it, part 5 has got it, and I think part 7 and part 4 might also have it.
Robert Ryan has asked, hi Bruce, is the
Thank you.
AS1665 committee currently active?
Yes, we've kicked off, and our first meeting is scheduled for in about 2 to 3 weeks' time. I'm very pleased to be able to say that.
Bruce?
Yeah.
Bruce, Kev Borner here. Regarding the comment I made earlier regarding the hardness problems in overseas materials, I have come to the conclusion that it's possible that that I put a caveat in the welding procedures, particularly the WPSs as well, to inform the user that if you're using Australian material, the preheat tables that are included in there will be much the same as alignment with 1554 series.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're acquiring overseas materials with a carbon equivalent, including boron and elevated levels of, or not elevated levels, but higher CEQ values, particularly from some countries, that they increase the preheat in that case, because a lot of companies are actually not worrying too much about what materials coming in and what they're using for their manufacture. But when they fail something like $100,000 in welding procedures, they soon learn very rapidly.
Right.
So is that proposal to put something like that in the standards, in the welding procedures documentation, is that going to impose any problems you can foresee or the audience can foresee in the future?
I don't know that something like that would go into a standard, but a comment like that could very well finish up in the commentary.
Yep. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know from the audience if they've had other, in a private sense, if they've had other problems in this regard.
If
Guys,
people have, put your comments in the chat, please.
Yep. All right, I'll sign off now.
We had another question from Robert Ryan. Are you looking for members on that project, the AS 1665?
It depends what your level of expertise is and what your interest is. If you send the details to Weld Australia, I'll discuss the matter with with Standards Australia and the chair, because the chair is ultimately responsible for who is and who isn't on a subcommittee, because it's a subcommittee that'll be managing the process. But if you've got the time and inclination to be active on this subcommittee, knowing that we're going to be running meetings potentially for up to 18 months plus, and you're prepared to devote that time, then certainly get in touch and I'll pass the relevant information on. I'd dearly like to know what expertise you've got on the welding of aluminium as well. That will be particularly important.
All right, any further questions? Well, thank you everyone for attending. We'll send through the recording a bit later this afternoon. Thank you, Bruce.
Well, thank you, one and all. Thank you, everybody, for attending. I will stop the share now.
All right.
And thank you, one and all, for attending. And as was mentioned earlier by Simon, we do have a seminar or webinar coming up later this month on the documentation and on the joint working groups that we've set up with both the Canadians and the Edison Welding Institute. So please watch this space. Thank you, everybody.
Yep, that's on the 29th of April.
Ah, great. Thank you.
All right, thanks everyone. I'm going to stop recording now. Thank you.